Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the New York State adult use proposed regulations read through. It is January 5th, and we are moving steadily through this read through. Today, we'll be diving into part 121 of the proposed regs, which is page 100 of the regulations. Today, as usual, we're going to be digesting these proposed regs, and the point is to create more of a conversational context around the regulations to help educate, engage. And given that there's probably just over 40 days left in this proposed regulation comment period, we're hoping that this conversation can create perspective to help empower folks in finding their comments in this comment process. Everyone's perspective matters. The idea is that through this breakdown, we find places of curiosity or question that either we can request a change and offer a proposal to the state, or request clarification as to why is this like this. And so, yeah, through this process, we'll be having a lot of side commentary regarding these regulations. We may we'll put our professional hats on. We may take our professional hats off and offer personal perspective. But all again to create context to help make these regulations more digestible. Today we're joined. This program is brought to you by CANY, the Cannabis Association in New York, in partnership with the Rochester Public Library. And the idea is that having access to this kind of information is a foundational requirement to having an equitable industry. So education and information accessibility is just the bottom line for us, and we're super happy to be here providing this context. Jason, I'll let you introduce yourself before we dive in, and I'll join in soon.
All right. Jason Klemick. I am the chair of the policy committee for the Cannabis Association of New York, as well as the chair of the tax committee for the New York State Bar's Cannabis Law section, and I lead the cannabis practice at Barclay Damon.
Great. Yeah, my name is Zach Sarkis. I am the chair of the education committee for CANY. I sit on the policy committee of CANY as well, and been working with the Rochester Public Library and helping build out their cannabis programming, support services. Also a cultivator and a small business owner. So I bring that operator perspective here, as well as just the interest in these regs. So we'll be joined by our colleague Elise Bergio, who we'll introduce once they join. And yeah, par for the course. It's if you got any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. The chat is live and well for those who are with us live. And the Q&A is also there to ask more formal questions that we can make sure we don't miss. So we'll keep an eye on both the chat and the Q&A just to make sure that we're staying on it. If you are joining us, feel free to drop in the chat who you are and where you're calling in from, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to share my screen per usual, and we'll just continue our breakdown of the regs. Share screen here. All right, cool. Can you see this all right, Jason? Great. So we're entering into part 121, the social and economic equity adult use cannabis. This will provide the qualifications, ownership and control, the duty to disclose, commitment to social equity and economic equity, and severability. And this is super important because this is like the cornerstone of this is like the expression of that cornerstone of the MRTA that's built on social and economic equity. So this is the description of how this is going to be rolled out, and how those who qualify as social and economic equity applicants will be kind of moderated through this industry build out. If anything else you'd like to add to that, Jason?
Well, this is one of the main components from the law. So a lot of this is derived right from section 87 of the cannabis law. But as we're going to kind of get into it, we're going to start to notice, I think, a few potential discrepancies. And I think they're important to discuss because if you have regulations that don't comport with the law, that's a potential problem that could produce delays. So I think it's really important to make sure that, you know, when people are looking at this, potentially commenting, is making sure that the regulations do in fact reflect what the law says and the intent of the law.
Yep. All right. So qualifications for a social and economic equity applicant. I can dive in first. General qualifications. To qualify as a social and economic equity applicant, an applicant shall demonstrate through the mandatory production of documents and other information described in this part. 1, that sole control of the applicant is held by an individual from a community disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition. A minority-owned business, a woman-owned business, a distressed farmer, or a service-disabled veteran-owned business. B, if sole control of the applicant is held by a woman who is also a minority group member or women who are also minority group members, the applicant may qualify as a minority-owned business, a woman-owned business, or both. C, request for information. The office may request any information necessary for determining eligibility of social and economic equity applicant. And D, individuals from communities disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition. An applicant seeking to qualify as an individual from a community disproportionately impacted shall provide 1, proof of ownership and sole control over the applicant by one or more such members that qualify as individuals from communities disproportionately impacted set forth by this part, and documentation to show that one or more members that have ownership interest in the business have resided in a community disproportionately impacted for an aggregate of 3 of the first 18 years of their life, or an aggregate of 5 of the 10 years preceding the timeframe designated for a community disproportionately impacted, provided that the community disproportionately impacted was also designated a community disproportionately impacted for a majority of those years. The office may also take into consideration a break in residency due to incarceration, education, illness, foster care, custodial matters, homelessness, and other circumstances in determining whether an applicant meets the residency requirement. So I think that, again, that's 3 of the first 18 years of their life, or 5 of the 10 years preceding that time frame, provided that the community has been designated for a majority of those years. And so, as I understand it, OCM is crunching numbers on all like going back through the records of paper records, digital records, to see where like the paper trail of enforcement across New York State. And they'll be using that as a reference point to better understand who was disproportionately impacted. So just to kind of get an idea of how they'll do that. It'll probably be some form of map or regionality, but probably get pretty specific. Cool. For the purpose of determining whether an area is a community disproportionately impacted, the office may review geographic areas such as precincts, zip codes, neighborhoods, political subdivisions, and any other geographic area for the history of arrests, the number of convictions, law enforcement procedures, protocols, and practices, allocation of law enforcement resources, economic and socioeconomic factors, including but not limited to unemployment, medium household income, children moved from the house by Child Protective Services, or the equivalent of out-of-state jurisdictions due to parents, caretakers, marijuana use or arrest, school suspension records, and high school attainment. Deportation records for marijuana offenses, and any other impacts as determined by the office reflecting a relative disparate enforcement of cannabis prohibition laws during a certain period of time.
So I want to just mention something right here. This OCM, I think, needs to be very careful about, because this has implications with the dormant commerce clause, like we've seen in the card lawsuit. So it is good to see in the number 5 there, they say equivalent for out-of-state jurisdictions. So perhaps they're going to start thinking about communities that have been disproportionately impacted anywhere in the United States, which would avoid the dormant commerce clause issue. Because if they just said we're looking at New York State disproportionately impacted communities, we've seen how that's turned out in the card lawsuit. Is a state is or a court has already said they believe that this is, probably violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. So it's really important when we're navigating this that, these issues are front and center, because it could end up delaying the program.
I appreciate that a lot. There's a lot of like nitpicky things, and when it comes to lawsuits, the state is definitely a big old target for anywhere they mess up. So F, a minority-owned business. An applicant seeking to qualify as a minority-owned business shall provide proof of ownership and sole control by one or more minority group members who have an ownership interest in the business as set forth in this part. And 2, at least one of the following: proof of a state MWBE certification on the basis of being a minority-owned business, or a sworn declaration that reports information relating to its business enterprise to be true and accurate and made under the penalties provided by law, that A, no one or more members of the minority group who are citizens or permanent resident aliens of the United States of America, 1, have an ownership interest in the business, 2, qualify as a minority group as defined in the cannabis law or as the office may determine, and then B, includes a statement that providing false information shall be the grounds for action against the applicant or licensee, including but not limited to the denial, suspension, cancellation, or revocation of a license. Don't play around. Woman-owned business. So an applicant seeking to qualify as a woman-owned business shall provide 1, proof of ownership and sole control by one or more of women group members who have an ownership interest in the business as set forth in this part, and at least one of the following: proof of state MWBE certification and on the basis of a woman being a woman-owned business, or a sworn declaration that reports information relating to its business enterprise to be true and accurate and made under the penalties of law, provided that A, one or more members of a woman group who are citizens or permanent resident aliens of the United States of America, 1, have an ownership interest in the business, and 2, qualify as women members as defined by cannabis law as the office may determine. And B, includes a statement that providing false information shall be the grounds against the applicant or licensee, but not limited to, including but not limited to, the denial, suspension, cancellation, or revocation. All right, so distressed farmer. An applicant seeking to qualify as a distressed farmer shall provide proof of ownership and sole control by one or more members who have an ownership interest as set forth in this part. 2, proof that the applicant meets the small farm classification as developed by the Economic Research Service of the United States Department of Agriculture. And 2, is filed a Schedule F tax return. And 3, filed other tax forms demonstrating revenues below the qualifying thresholds established therein. 3, one of the following: documentation of operating losses during the last 3 years. Or 3, proof of membership in a group historically underrepresented in farm ownership, as such group or groups may be defined by the board, as provided by sworn declaration that one or more of the members qualifies as a member of the group or groups identified by the board, and that shall include a statement providing that the false information shall be grounds for action, including but not limited to the denial, suspension, cancellation, or revocation of license. Service disabled veteran-owned business. An applicant seeking to qualify as a service disabled veteran-owned business shall provide 1, proof of ownership and sole control by one or more members who have an ownership interest as set forth in this part. 2, certification from the New York State Office of General Services Division of Service Disabled Veterans Business Development, the BSDVBD. In the event that a business does not receive certification from the BSDVBD prior to the filing of an application, office may temporarily accept the following documents as a conditional certification: DD-214S and or NG-214S with line of duty report, U.S. Veterans Administrative Documentation, and service-connected disability rating, which shall be dated within 1 year of the date of the DSD-VBD receives the DSD-VBD certification application, and shall demonstrate a service-connected disability rating of at least 10%. Any such conditional certification shall be valid for 60 days pending full certification from the DSDVBD and may be extended in the office sole discretion. Small business qualification. An applicant seeking to qualify as a minority-owned business or a women-owned business shall submit the following documents to demonstrate it's a small business. If it has been in operation for a time greater than or equal to 3 years, including but not limited to quarterly payroll reports from the last 3 years, and any other information that demonstrates that the entity is a small business as requested by the office. And 2, it has been in operation for a time less than 3 years, it shall submit. So if it hasn't been in operation for 3 years, it shall submit a sworn declaration that reports the following information relating to its business enterprise to be true and accurate and made under the penalties provided by the law that it is a small business as defined in subdivision J of this section. And such declaration shall include a statement that providing false information shall be the grounds for action, including but not limited to the denial, suspension, cancellation, revocation of a license, and documentation of a small business operations, including but not limited to any and all gross quarterly receipts, bylaws, and proof that the business has no more and will not exceed 100 employees. All right, and K, extra priority. A person who demonstrates that they are an individual from a community disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition may receive extra priority if they have an income lower than 80% of the median income of the county in which the applicant resides, and was convicted of marijuana-related offense prior to the effective date of the act, or had a parent, guardian, child, spouse, or dependent, or was dependent on an individual who, prior to the effective date of the act, was convicted of a marijuana-related offense. And for the purpose of the subdivision, median income is defined by the median dollar amount per household in each county as based on the overall income distribution for the county from lowest to highest income. And an applicant seeking to qualify as an extra priority shall provide proof of residency, income, and conviction as prescribed by the board. And welcome, Elise. Jason, Elise, you want to just check in, introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late. My name is Elise Bergio. I am part of the CANY Policy Committee and Executive Leadership for New York State Bar Association, and I am General Counsel for 2 women-owned businesses in the cannabis space.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, Jason, you want to take over ownership and sole control minimums?
Yeah. So this is definitely a very important section because there is this sole control requirement, and this is where a lot of games could try to be played, particularly when you're trying to qualify as a social equity applicant, but you have people who are investing money who are not the qualifying applicants who maybe want that control. You know, if you're a woman and you're the 51% owner, but somebody who doesn't qualify is giving you $1 million or something like that, they may not want to vest you in sole control of everything because it's their $1 million. So they made this section pretty strict, and it's really something that's going to have to be carefully drafted in operating agreements, shareholders agreements, things like that. So with that, we'll dive in. All right, so section 121.2, ownership and sole control minimums. An applicant seeking to qualify as an individual from a community disproportionately impact minority-owned business, women-owned business, service-disabled, veteran-owned business, or distressed farmer shall submit documents sufficient to demonstrate ownership and sole control by an individual or group of individuals who are from a community disproportionately impacted, members of a minority group, women, service-disabled, veterans, or distressed farmers, as defined in the cannabis law and as qualified in section 121.1 of this title, including but not limited to the factor in the following: bylaws, delegations of authority or resolutions of the board of directors if applicable, any and all incorporation documents that describe all shares of stock or other securities, statements, agreements, or memoranda of understanding issued during the time of incorporation or organization or at any time thereafter that remain in full force and effect at the time of application or in response to demand of the office. quarterly payroll records filed with the New York State Department of Labor or equivalent for out-of-state jurisdictions to demonstrate the size of the workforce. Comparison of employee and executive compensation, comparison of executive compensation, shareholder compensation or proceeds, and any other information requested by the office to determine ownership and sole control. And the reason that they're doing 5 and 6 there is to see if you're playing games. If you're the 51% owner, but you're only getting 10% of the compensation, they might say, well, does that sound like sole control to us? And are you really the beneficial owner? B, an applicant seeking to qualify as an individual from a community disproportionately impacted, minority-owned business, women-owned business, service-disabled, veteran-owned business, or distressed farmer, upon demonstration to the office that they are unable to provide any documentation requested and required in subdivision A of this section, may be permitted to submit a separate documentation to the office that provides proof that the business has established corporate governance policies within 30 days of submitting the application to reflect the authority and sole control requirements stated therein as determined by the office. If at any time after a social and economic equity applicant has been granted a license, the office determines that the sole control requirement is violated, the office may institute an action to suspend or revoke such license, provided the office provides an opportunity to cure. And just remember that sole control is defined up in the definition section, part 118. So, it's worth it to go back and look and see exactly what that means, because it's a pretty strict definition. Section 121.3, continuing duty to disclose and failure to disclose notification. A social and economic equity applicant shall have a continuing duty to disclose any material changes in the information provided to the office as required in this part for the duration of the license. Any changes that would impact a social and economic equity licensee's status as an individual from a community disproportionately impacted, minority-owned business, women-owned business, service-disabled, veteran-owned business, or distressed farmer shall require notice to the office and pre-written approval of the board. Failure to notify the office of any material change in the information provided may provide the sole grounds for enforcement action against the licensee, including but not limited to suspension, revocation, or denial of a license.
Jason, we got a question in the chat. So to qualify for social equity status, must an NWBE also be a small business? And if yes, does that mean that the applicant itself, which is likely a new startup, be an established business, or will they look at the prior business history of the individual partners comprising to the startup to qualify for a small business status?
So it's my understanding that, one, if you're a MWBE currently and your MWBE business is not the one that's applying, and you have a business that's less than a year old, you can show documentation from your MWBE business for some of these requirements, which is like showing retention rates, showing your social and economic hiring rates, things like that, what your minimum hourly is. But for purposes, you're most likely, like, for example, you're going to most likely apply as just a women-owned business or a minority-owned business and not be a business enterprise once you submit, if you're not already an MWBE, because it takes 3 years to go through that process. So, and you have to have, years of being in business before you've even submitted to MWBE, because you have to show look-back rules. So, if you're a new startup, more likely than not, you're not going to be an MWBE business right off the bat when you're applying, and you're going to have to apply as just a woman or minority owned with supplemental information from existing businesses. Mm-hmm. Jason, do you have anything different on that?
No, I think that's exactly it. Is, as lawyers, we're always going to recommend you form a new entity. Because whatever you were doing before was probably not in the cannabis space, and it is just wreck your taxes, banking, everything. So you're going to be a new entity, which means that you're going to fall under the other part that we talked about. If it has been in operation for a time less than 3 years, you're going to submit the sworn declaration, documentation of small business operations, things like that. So yeah, that's probably where you're going to live for the most part, and then you'll be able to qualify as a woman-owned business or a minority-owned business, but you will not be initially a woman minority-owned business enterprise, which is its own distinguishing entity within New York State, or designation, I should say, within New York
Yeah,
State.
I would say it's confusing for most people too, right? Because when we talk about women-owned and minority-owned business, we automatically transition it into that enterprise classification, which in this situation, it's not. That's actually beneficial too, because it's a lot more lenient of a standard when we're just talking about a majority ownership of either minority or women.
Absolutely.
And so just kind of play on this, there's a question from Ira saying, like, is there a maximum sales dollar threshold for disqualification of this type of classification? And I think it's like, what was clear is like, if you have more than 100 employees, you may disqualify from that type of description. Maybe that's for small business specifically, but I haven't seen anything for dollar threshold, but curious if you guys have heard anything.
So there's a dollar threshold for personal income on an MWBE status.
I think it's somewhere in like the 3 million range or something like that.
Like 3 or 4 million.
Yeah.
But that's again very specific. That's simply for WBE or MBE businesses. It's not written anywhere in our regulations. That would be a different standard within a different agency of New York. But just like Zach said, the way that they are looking at small business isn't monetarily, it's really through an employment lens.
That's the Turtle and Hughes clause.
I don't get the joke. I don't know that Turtle and Hughes clause. Do you know it, Zach? Somebody explain.
I don't know if it's for me, it's real. I'm not a clause expert.
I just imagine the turtles, but whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then Jen says the typical size, a designation that said, typically a size designation that said the definition of small business employees can be from 50 to 500. Cool.
It's all going to depend on where they pull the definitions from, because like if you were an S corporation, for example, the IRS allows you to only, like, they look at it monetarily and the number of shareholders. So it all depends on where they decide to pull these definitions from, which they really haven't kind of indicated at this point, I think.
Cool. Thanks for that information, Ira. Definitely some stuff to look into.
All right. Whistleblower complaint and recourse. And we were talking about this yesterday on a different call, and it's kind of interesting. So I'll follow up on right after this, but so whistleblower complaint and recourse. If at any time any owner, director, investor, board member, or employee of a social and economic equity licensee has reason to believe that the business failed to disclose any material changes to the information provided to the office, including changes to status as a business owner or owned by an individual from a community disproportionately impacted, minority-owned business or women-owned business, service-disabled, veteran-owned business, or distressed farmer, the status and ownership and control, such person may notify the office for consideration of any enforcement action. Any such person that notifies the office for consideration of any enforcement action pursuant to this subdivision shall be given the full protection of Article 20C of the labor law. So it's just interesting that like they pull all of this in and give you the whistleblower protection, but it's specifically for the women minority owned business, or call it social equity applicant business status. I'm assuming off the top of my head, I don't know the labor law, but probably whistleblower protection provides protection for all other kind of business cases. So that's maybe why they were calling specifically out these social equity businesses, is saying, you know, to make sure if something happens, you are protected under the whistleblower law if you blow the whistle.
Cool.
All right. Section 121.4, commitment to social and economic equity. An applicant or licensee, as defined in section 118.1 of this title, may be required to demonstrate their commitment to the social and economic equity goals of the cannabis law as part of the application process. Such commitment may be demonstrated by the design and implementation of a community impact plan. A community impact plan shall show an applicant's or licensee's plan for how the applicant or licensee will benefit communities and individuals from communities that were disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition, including but not limited to. And I just want to pause for a second because there's two things to unpack there. One is this is everybody. This is not just non-social equity applicants that need this. This is every applicant. And the use of the term applicant is important. This isn't just licensee. This is one of two plans that is going with your application, not once you get your provisional license and you have to do other plans. This and the energy plan are two plans that go along with your application to OCM. So it's really important. This is a huge part of what will be the application.
And just like Jason said, there isn't that much that you're going to need necessarily to apply with other than like financial information regarding your true parties of interest. And then these two plans. So application isn't a crazy lift. It's definitely a lift, but it isn't, as strict or as overbearing as some of these other states have required. So these are things you really want to focus on and stuff you can do right now. Right. This is stuff you can go back and start at the exact moment.
Yeah. I mean, the regs are giving you the outline. Maybe we'll get a little more guidance from OCM, but the regs are giving you the outline of what these plans need to contain. So everybody who wants to get a license should start at least outlining and figuring it out, because let's say that, applications are June, July, August. That might sound like a while from now. It's going to be here before you know it. And you don't want to be pulling together those plans then.
Sure.
All right, diving in. So, including but not limited to identification of the community or communities and or individuals disproportionately impacted that the applicant or licensee plans to benefit.
Which is interesting. Could we argue that you can't actually frame this out until the data from OCM comes out to define who those communities are?
I mean, yes, but you probably could do some of the preliminary research yourself, and you're probably going to be right. Like if you looked up census data that showed high arrest rates, high unemployment rates, things like that, you're probably going to be in the right neighborhood. But yeah, I mean, have an idea.
Not wrong. Yeah, I mean, we are waiting on Damien's social equity report and plan. It's my understanding it's going to come out in sometime in Q1.
That's right, Damien. We know you're watching somewhere out there.
Yeah.
Live or recorded. We're waiting on you, buddy.
I don't know. So there's a lot of back and forth on this. I think this is Damien just came on. He is supposed to report this publicly, but
I do know that there is a very active consolidation of all records happening as we speak, and I would expect that to be released pretty darn soon.
I think I'm glad, I hope people are giving Damien a little leeway on this. He was appointed, it's been within a year of his appointment, and they're doing a really heavy feed on the social equity plan. So I know he's getting some slack from Brad Orsino, but I think he's doing a good job.
Jen wanted to clarify, census doesn't track arrests, but the police departments do. And I'm sure you could FOIL too, like do some FOIL searching through New York State Department of whatever.
And hopefully there's going to be a tool, because Connecticut, they had something like this when their social and economic equity applicants actually just looked at these factors that we've been talking about, and they actually came out with a tool where you would hover over the different areas and they would give you that information. So hopefully New York State will throw together a tool like that. That'd be super helpful.
Yep.
If you're listening. Okay. So, all right. A description of the benefits that the applicant or licensee will provide to the community or individuals disproportionately impacted, including but not limited to workforce opportunities, community resources, education, and other community building programs. The size or the scale or size of the disproportionately impacted target beneficiaries. The plan for implementation, including but not limited to actions, activities, and engagements that will be performed by the applicant or licensee, and frequency of engagement with the community or individuals disproportionately impacted. A demonstrated need of the proposed benefit to the community and individuals disproportionately impacted, including but not limited to economic and social impact. identifiable resources the applicant or licensee will use to execute the plan, including but not limited to a demonstrable partnership or relationship with a community-based organization or other association, estimated expenses, if any, the applicant or licensee will incur to execute the proposed plan and its activities. And just on that one, be careful with those expenses. Those are going to be non-deductible expenses because they don't go into your cost of goods. So, just keep that in mind. And remember too, that anything you commit to in the application, you got to show how you acted on that when you go for your renewal. So there's granular detail, but there's also big picture too. The applicant or licensee's demonstrated ability, knowledge, expertise, or experience, and any other proof of community engagement. A description of the applicant's or licensee's strategy to measure, track, and record the performance and execution of the plan that identifies qualitative and quantitative metrics and includes frequency of tracking such metrics. A statement by the applicant or licensee supporting its ability to execute on the proposed plan as described in the application based on the suitability and appropriateness of the metrics and the applicant or licensee will use to measure the success of the proposed plan and the nexus described between the plan's desired outcome, implementation strategy, and the applicant's or licensee's demonstrated ability to execute the plan, and any other requirements for a community impact plan as defined by the board.
So it's definitely not just a random idea.
Right.
And I just understanding again the roots, like we led with this presentation, this particular digest of 121. It's like this is a core pillar. This is unveiling one of the meat on the bones that are that core pillar of the MRTA. So this won't be taken lightly.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how much stuff you're going to have to do. This is almost creating like a business plan within a business plan, because you're going to be looking at the potential expenses, measuring the metrics of just this social equity thing, not just your entire business, which you would normally, that would be the one part that you'd really be doing. So, it's a lot of work. Start now. And lastly, any person, vendor, contractor, entity, or individual knowingly engaged in business with an enterprise revealed to be fraudulently qualified as social and economic equity licensee may be permanently barred from receiving a license from the office after investigation. And the severability, if anything's held invalid, it doesn't affect the rest.
Cool.
All right. Elise, you want to take one?
Boom. Wow. The moment the crowd has been waiting for.
Giddy up.
Woo-hoo, yes.
It only took us 118 pages to get to the meat.
I tell you what, the floodgates are going to start opening up. People are going to be very excited in the chat. The world is going crazy right now, folks. We are entering into part 123, which is the license-specific authorizations, requirements, and prohibitions. So this is going to create, frame, and explain all you really need to know when deciding or exploring a particular business model. And also, this is really great for anyone who's trying to find themselves within the plant touching supply chain or ancillary, like understanding how all of these businesses, these licenses can operate as individuals and operate together is really the best way to get a comprehensive understanding of this entire ecosystem at play. Because whether you're going for one license or you're looking to be a service provider of license types, understanding the fabric and the relationships which are allowed and not allowed, what kind of production methodology is allowed or not allowed, all of that is super, super critical. And that's what we'll unpack in this section right here. All right, so we will start off, we'll explore nursery ownership, interest, authorization, prohibitions, operations, cultivation, ownership, interest, authorization, prohibitions, and then operations. It goes processor, then distributor, then retail, micro business, cooperative, registered organization, and so the ROND and the RODs, and delivery operations, and then severability. So this is going to be a big, healthy section. I will probably take a few calls to break this down, but this is definitely where it gets juicy. And again, we're looking, all of everything we've read up until this point sets the context of how then you approach this license type. So, the application process, the qualifications, even that, again, the plan of environmental plan, your social equity plan, etc., all is the precondition to then you determining how you want to navigate in this market or how you actually get to play in this space. Elise, have any interest?
Let's hit it. Okay. So 123.1 nursery ownership interests and business authorizations and prohibitions. A licensed activities. A nursery shall not hold a dispensary license, on-site consumption, or delivery license, meaning it's in that supply chain tier. So a nursery may also hold a cultivator, cooperative, micro business, registered organization, ROND or ROD license. A nursery may produce and sell clones, seedlings, and mature cannabis plants, clone propagation material, tissue culture, and cannabis seed for sale only to duly licensed nursery, cultivator, co-op, micro, ROND or ROD retail dispensary or registered organization, New York State. That means it is only B2B, business to business. It is not business to consumer. You cannot sell directly to someone coming up to your farm and asking to purchase any of the above products. A nursery may propagate mature cannabis plants solely for use in production of the aforementioned products or for sale to other nurseries for the same purposes. Okay, a nursery or its true party of interest may be a true party of interest in a cultivator, processor, distributor, co-op, micro, or ROND license. A nursery may only hold one nursery license, but may cultivate at multiple premises, and their true parties of interest are not restricted in the number of nursery license they can have an interest in, meaning,
that's a very interesting one. And I think this is kind of a quiet, like a silent elephant in the room that just like, genetics is really an important piece of this industry. And this is saying that like someone a TPI, which could be a genetics company from out of state, can have be a TPI in unlimited nurseries. So they could provide their genetics to unlimited nurseries, for example, as I read that.
It's also like, as we described, TPIs are activated pretty easily in this business with, officers, people who obviously qualify monetarily, business decision-making powers. Those people, you can pack up a nursery, meaning your business can have a nursery license. They could have a nursery license. Every member of your team can technically have a nursery license. So you might see people having large scale nurseries on one location if it's broken up appropriately with addresses and such. Or if we find out more about co-location, which has been pretty silent in the reg so far.
Yep.
A nursery or its true party of interest may be a landlord, financier, or goods and services provider to an adult use cultivator, processor, distributor, co-op, micro, and ROND license, subject to the limitations and other ownership, control, and interest requirements and prohibitions of the cannabis law in this chapter. In addition to any other restrictions or prohibitions in this part, including but not limited to Part 124 of this title, no nursery license or its true party of interest shall be permitted to hold a direct or indirect interest in or be a true party of interest, passive investor, landlord, financier, or management service provider, or by any other means to a retail dispensary, on-site consumption, delivery, RO, or cannabis lab licensee or permittee. Where a nursery license is held by a ROD, the license and its TPI shall be subject to the TPI prohibitions and authorizations set forth for the ROD licenses. So just so you know, like, it's always about the supply chain division. It's always about one tier or the other. If you're going to be in the nursery, cultivation, processing, distribution tier, you're in that tier. If you want to be in the retail on-site tier, you're in that tier. There's obviously they really want to prohibit crossover.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, nursery operations. A nursery shall sell seeds, seedlings, clones, and immature plants or cannabis plants in vegetative stage under 2 feet in height.
It's important to note that here, the definition of immature cannabis plant here is different than the definition of immature in the AUCC license, as well as in other places. that describe the difference in height and to be a signifier of maturity, etc., or even when it gets transplanted. And I think that's just something to be wary of like, we're going to start seeing a lot of numbers, a lot of descriptions about square footage or canopy this. And I think that, there is definitely some hairs to split to really make sure everything is lined up here. Because, again, vegetative stage under 2 feet height, like there are plenty of cases where folks sell vegetative plants that are 4 feet tall, etc. So I think it's just, that's not that's not a standard, but just understanding that like, okay, if it is if it's over 2 feet tall and vegetative height, in some cases you could see that it crosses the definition of immature into mature just by that definition of height, not the definition of the plant expressing its sex, which is just interesting to note.
Sorry, because you take
all
over.
right.
My dog's going crazy.
Yeah, I'll pick it up. So 2, the use of any plants in flowering stage only for seed production, and destroy or compost such plants, therefore pursuant to part 125 of this title. So you're definitely not doing any production that'll go to market of a flower cannabinoid product. 3, documentation of all information related to the production of genetic sourcing, which shall be made available for review by the office upon request. And this is a question too of like, the immaculate conception of genetics. Where did they come from? Is it a local breeder who's been breeding like in the legacy market? Is it a national sourced product or international? It's one thing if you source it from the West Coast, now that the DEA has like changed their perspective on what is like a THC or what's a marijuana product versus what's hemp. But still, if you're sourcing from a European country, for example, and is that breaching international, barriers? Is that illegal internationally? And is that going to run risk for anybody when it comes to like the traceability of where your genetics come from? So just interesting to note. You must label each immature cannabis plant or vegetative cannabis plant transferred for sale with the following: the cultivator name in bold, the potential cannabinoid potency as confirmed by testing of the parent cannabis plant, which at a minimum should include the total THC and CBD levels as defined by part 128 of this title, the date of seed planting and germination, the unique identifier that number that corresponds to the immature cannabis plant or vegetative plant lot, any pesticides used in cultivation, the name of the license number of the nursery licensee that cultivated the immature cannabis plant or vegetative cannabis plant, and any other information as determined by the office. So I will say, if you just stopped reading here, it shows that every single plant has to be labeled with a tag. And that is also inconsistent with other language elsewhere in this in the regs. And what I will say is, like, if you buy a tray of seedlings from a nursery, a tray may come with 50 3-inch tall seedlings. They're not you can't tie any kind of RFID or like code to such a small little seedling. And there's other places where it talks about the ability to have a tray being signified as the lot, instead of every single seedling being registered and tracked. And just knowing, again, like, you could buy a tray of 75 seedlings, and these things are tiny when you get them. So the idea that every single plant has to be tagged in this process is just a little bit, it's just interesting to know. Not saying it's impossible, but it's cumbersome and definitely expensive. And you also have risk of damaging seedlings if you're trying to connect them to a big old tag, which are really the only options at this point in time. So 5, they may sell seeds and clone, or they have to sell clones and seedlings with a written guarantee that the clones sold do not harbor known cannabis diseases such as hop latent viroid, cannabis cryptic virus, or other common cannabis diseases and pests. They must be authorized to sell agricultural products used specifically for the planting, propagation, and cultivation of cannabis. A nursery is prohibited from selling any cannabis plants in the flowering stage, cultivating cannabis in a canopy larger than the area authorized pursuant to section 120.3 of this title, and selling or transferring of any cannabis seeds, or immature cannabis plants to a cannabis consumer. So there's that again, like you can't sell directly to a consumer. All right, cultivator ownership, interest, business authorization, and prohibitions. A cultivator may engage in the following licensed activities: acquire, possess, cultivate, trim, harvest, dry, and cure cannabis at its licensed premises. Sell cannabis only to a licensee that authorizes the processing of cannabis, which may include a duly licensed processor, microbusiness, cooperative, ROD, ROND, and cannabis research licensee. Prohibited from send cannabis to a processor for processing without, no, this is permitted, correct? I'm sorry, there are permitted to, I got confused with the nursery, permitted to send cannabis to a processor for processing without relinquishing of the ownership of that cannabis. So you can have ownership, you can send your flower to a processor who can package it for you without you losing ownership, and technically it could be transferred back to you. And then you could do self-distribute, for example. If a cultivator also holds a processor license, they may purchase cannabis from another cultivator for processing. A processor that has a processor license may apply for and obtain one distributor license. And so no person shall be a true party of interest in more than one cultivator, provided, however, a passive investor may be a passive investor in more than one cultivator if such passive investor complies with all other ownership, control, and interest requirements and prohibitions of the cannabis law in this chapter. A cultivator or its true party of interest may be a true party of interest in a processor, distributor, cooperative, microbusiness, and or ROND license. And a cultivator or its true party of interest may be the landlord, financier, or a goods and service provider to an adult use cultivator, processor, distributor, cooperative, microbusiness, or ROND license, subject to all restrictions governing such relations, including but not limited to undue influence, control, and true party of interest requirements. In addition to any other restriction in this chapter, including but not limited to Part 124 of this title, no cultivator or true party of interest is permitted to have any direct or indirect interest, including but not limited to a true party of interest, passive investor, landlord, financier, or managed service provider to a retail dispensary, on-site consumption, delivery, ROD, registered organization, or cannabis laboratory license or permittee. A conditional cultivator license pursuant to the section 68C of the cannabis law is subject to all rules and regulations of the title applicable to the cultivator. Such conditional cultivator, determined to be in good standing by the office upon submitting any necessary forms required by the office and upon full payment of any applicable fees, be permitted to transition to a full license in one of the following cultivator license tier. Tier 4 outdoor license, Tier 2 combination license. A conditional cultivator shall be given the priority by the office in review of its application for a full cultivator, processor, or distributor license under this chapter. Jason, can you pick up cultivator operations?
Yes. All right. Cultivator operations. A cultivator may acquire cuttings, seedlings, seeds, and clones from any licensee authorized as a nursery. Immature cannabis plants. A cultivator shall assign a tag to each established lot of immature cannabis plants. The tag shall have at minimum the cultivar name and the lot name or code. A lot of immature cannabis plants under a single plant tag shall be uniform in cultivar and contain no more than 100 individual immature cannabis plants at any one time.
So that right there, that's this whole tray thing. Like you can get a tray, essentially one tag can, in this case, can cover two 50 cell trays of immature plants. And so here's a question I have for OCM, like why would you have to have every single plant tagged from a nursery to this cultivator, where in this case of the cultivator, they can have, 100 of one particular lot. And again, it's like it's a reduction of plastic use. It's a reduction. It's like the cumbersome nature of trying to tag every single plant, especially seedlings. I think this makes sense. You can easily track a tray with 50 plants on it or 100 plants on it and have that be in a lot that's registered and tracked all the way through your entire production system. But to kind of make it so a nursery would have to tag every single one of those small plants to then it can come to a cultivator where it's not mandated that all those plants be tagged individually is a discrepancy that I would ask them to justify further.
A lot plant tag shall be visible and within clear view of an individual standing next to the immature cannabis plant lot and be kept free from dirt and debris. Zach, did you bring up a point about this one previously?
It is when it comes to the mature cannabis plant out in the field. And that a plant tag, so it should be visible and clear. That's really easy when the plants are small, especially on a tray or individually. We see this becoming an issue when they say that same thing must be for a full grown mature plant, specifically in an outdoor setting. When they say it has to be, we'll see it shortly, and I'll break it down a little more then.
Each immature cannabis plant in the lot shall be labeled with a lot unique identifier and placed contiguous next to one another to facilitate identification of the lot unique identifier by the office, or instead of labeling each immature cannabis plant in the lot shall be fully separated from other lots of immature or mature cannabis plants. In such cases, an individual immature cannabis plant does not need to be labeled with the corresponding lot unique identifier. Within 3 calendar days of receiving or acquiring an immature cannabis plant, a cultivator shall assign a plant tag belonging to the cultivator in accordance with paragraph 3 of the subdivision. A plant tag shall be applied to each individual cannabis plant as specified in subdivision B of this section at the time the plant is moved to the designated canopy area or begins flowering. Mature cannabis plants. A mature cannabis plant shall be tagged with a plant tag. A plant tag shall be attached to the main stem of the base of each plant, placed in a position so it is visible and within clear view of an individual standing next to the mature cannabis plant and kept free from debris, dirt and debris.
And so this was my concern is, especially for outdoor production, you're not going to see in many cases, you're not going to see the base of the plant standing from a distance. Like, you know, some of these plants could be 6 feet wide by 6 feet tall. And so to say that there has to be a tag that's within clear view of someone standing next to it, kept free from dirt and debris, like at the very least, you're gonna have to get on your hands and knees and peel back the foliage to look to the inside of this plant to see the base, to see the stalk. So, I mean, that being said, there's different caretaking methodologies where that may not be the case, but specifically for outdoor production or for the planting of autoflowers, which is like high density sea of green, it's like if I have a 4 foot wide bed and I have a staggered planting and there's plants in the middle that are, you know, 2 feet from either side of the pathway, when there's also some more on the edge, like you're not going to immediately be able to see from a distance the base of that plant. So my concern is that someone would breach their you know, be in breach of compliance because of this is not, and it's just like, I think just making sure that every plant is tagged is important, if needed. That being said, you could argue that the way they describe the harvesting process, maybe not every plant needs to be tagged because the information that they're requesting in the track and trace is going to be the row information, not the plant specific information. So again, these are discrepancies that have costs. Every tag has a cost and a constraint. And it goes back to the lot, you know, a tray comes in, that tray goes out to rows. The OCM wants to know the tray lot and then the rows and the harvest date, not necessarily the individual plant. So why should every plant get tagged? You know, we could talk more about that offline.
All right. A cultivator is prohibited from removing the plant tag from the mature plant to which it was attached and assigned until the plant is harvested, destroyed, or disposed of. Harvested cannabis plants. Harvested plants that are hanging, drying, or curing shall be assigned a unique harvest batch name, which shall be recorded in the licensee's inventory tracking system and placed within clear view of an individual standing next to the batch. The assigned harvest batch name shall match the name that is in the licensee's inventory tracking system, and the harvest batch name attached to the physical batch shall be the same. Each harvest batch shall be assigned a tag or label and recorded in the inventory tracking system. For each harvested plant held in containers, the harvested batch shall be affixed to the container holding the batch. If harvested plants are held in multiple containers, the harvest batch name and the lot unique identifier shall be affixed to each of the containers. Additionally, each unit within a container shall be labeled with the harvest batch name and applicable lot unique identifier. All containers within the same lot unique identifier shall be placed contiguous to one another to facilitate identification by the office. Regenerative agricultural
Right.
practices.
So I just want to pause for a second. Again, there was no mention of individual plant data there. And that's just important to note, where again, like, why have to label every single plant if what they want to know is the row data, like the information of the harvest information, more than they want the plant data. Again, we could definitely have a conversation about that, but it's like, from an efficiencies and a cost standpoint, the data they want is about the lot, not about the individual. So it's just an interesting thing to note.
Regenerative agricultural practices. A cultivator shall take steps to further the promotion of biodiversity and shall submit evidence as determined by the office by implementing methods such as the following as appropriate to the cultivation methodologies and context: intercropping, crop rotation, planting or promotion of native plants, providing habitat for native animals, planting or promoting specific species that promote native pollinator activities, protecting native waterways through maintaining wild farm edges and removing invasive species, creating on-farm compost or locally sourcing organic compost to improve soil fertility, or other methods that promote biological diversity as approved by the office. Now, it strikes me that this seems to kind of really indicate outdoor growing, and it wouldn't necessarily be applicable to indoor or maybe even greenhouse growing. Is that
Yeah,
right?
and that's a tricky thing, because like, all these practices could be on-farm practices. A lot of these practices could be something you can do, like, you know, on any lot of production. Some of these things can be implemented, from pollinator species, you know, having, like, maintaining a wild farm edge, you know, those are all things that can be integrated off, like, not just in an outdoor production. But one of the concerns that we've heard is, like, this is very heavy. Like, a lot of this is intentional. It has costs. It takes time, energy, and labor. And is it falling undue on the outdoor cultivator, where it's something that no other cultivators necessarily would have to prove? And that's a question. Like, is that fair? And is it actually promoting sustainability, or is there room to like make this more broadly defining and accessible? Because in some cases, it seems like some folks may have to do everything in there, where some cultivators may not have to do anything in there. And it's just an interesting difference that has real life costs associated with it. But planting cover crops is not, it's not free. You know, doing, like, again, all of these things, it doesn't translate to automation, and there's also a learning curve there. I'm in full support of regenerative practices, and like, it's a necessity to build things, to build soil, build biodiversity, but just framing it in a way like, is this meant for everyone, or is it just for outdoor cultivation? And if so, like, are those costs, is there opportunity for others through the entire supply chain to do similar things on their land, and or offset it by investing, you know, on a farm? Like, could a processor contribute to this by helping offset and build these things on a local farm, for example? Like, it's kind of like the carbon credits thing. Like, you don't have to sequester the carbon yourself, but you can pay someone else to do that service for you. So is this just for outdoor production, or is this something the entire supply chain can, like, really focus on and push?
And we had a question come in from Ira. Could the state be concerned of individual plants going out the back door in regard to tagging?
Yep, definitely. And I do think that's the big thing there. the question becomes like, if you're planting in the soil, for example, it's going to be different than in a potted bag. You know, it really comes down to the methodology of production, and we're talking about leakage. Like, they do want to know if and where the plant goes, but I'll say that nowhere in this whole process is that particular plant like accounted for in its entire life cycle. Like, you can't remove that tag until the plant's destroyed. It's not necessarily just saying right now at this point that we have to report that that plant was destroyed or that the tag was removed. That being said, like, again, I can understand it. It's kind of an up and hill battle to argue that we shouldn't have to tag every individual plant. Leakage is definitely a big concern there. Yeah, and that is the question, like, of this seed to sale tracking method. Right now, as it stands, this seed to sale tracking method is mostly concerned with the seed lot. And a seed lot could be a group of immature plants up to 100 of one particular varietal. And so that is one lot, and that lot you have to say where that lot gets put in your production. So it's going to be maintained how many plants were in this zone. But then when it comes down to the harvest, we're not capturing individual plant data. And the issue is, like, when you're doing outdoor production or even mixed light, like, you can take more than one cut off of a cannabis plant. You can harvest it at different times. And so that means, like, does every single time you cut that plant, like, do you have to make a replica tag of that plant that gets carried all the way, like, to the bin? They're not saying that. They just want to know what row was it harvested on, or what lot was harvested under what date. So again, there's like, this is an opportunity for the OCM to clarify, at the very least, what they want and why. And then there is opportunity for cultivators to object or offer a counter proposal. So it's a really interesting point, and I'm not going to, like, I'm not expecting us not to have to tag every plant, but the OCM has some clarification here for sure. Great question.
All right. Agricultural inputs. The cultivator shall comply with all the rules and regulations of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation applicable to pesticide use for cannabis, and use only those pesticides registered by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or that specifically meet the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency registration exemption criteria for minimum risk pesticides, and only in accordance with 6 NYCRR section 325.2b and any other requirements for pesticide use for cannabis as determined by the board. Comply with all rules and regulations of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation applicable to the pesticide and the directions or instructions on the label of the pesticide for all pesticides that are exempt from registration requirements under 40 CFR 152.25, and ensure its pesticide application and storage protocols address storage of pesticides consistent with the label requirements in a secure building with controlled access, containment of any pesticide leaks and immediate cleanup of any spills, application of the minimum amount of pesticide necessary in accordance to the label, prevention of off-site drift, prohibition of application of pesticides when pollinators are present, prohibition of the application of pesticides that could drift to flowering plants attractive to pollinators, prohibition of direct spray or application of pesticides to surface water and groundwater, prohibition of pesticides drifting to surface water, and application of pesticides only when the wind is blowing away from surface water bodies near the cannabis plants.
So one thing I want to note here is, like, how do you define pollinators? And, like, you know, if you, like, there's a huge component of the cultivation process that is about reporting pests and animals, creatures, etc., like the integrated pest management. So you're constantly documenting and recording things that are happening in the garden from external life perspective. But, like, honeybees are pollinators, and they pollinate year round, you know, or like all spring and all summer and all fall. And so, you know, is this saying that if there's honeybees in the area on the fringe or in, like, on the farm, like, that you can't spray a pesticide? And I think that's just a clarification point. Like, is this it feels very broad and sweeping, and I'm curious if OCM would get more specific on that, you know, what pollinators, when, etc. And again, I'm not here to promote spraying pesticides, but there are certain pesticides that are, like, targeted towards caterpillars or towards specific things that are commonplace across the industry, across the country, and are very targeted. But as it stands, like I would say, okay, if there's honeybees around, or native bees or wild bees, then you can't use this when they're out, and they're pollinating all year round. So like how do we split that hair? Just, it's an interesting note to consider.
Okay, record any agricultural inputs used during cultivation, including but not limited to plant protection products, including beneficial insects, pesticides, fertilizers, and soil amendments. For each input, the input recording system or record keeping method of the licensee shall record the product name, active ingredients, purpose of usage, application rate, application date, method of application, persons doing the application, safety data and sheet and label information, weather condition at the time of application, and any other information as determined by the office. On-premises based identification. A cultivator shall have an on-premises based identification system that allows the cannabis and cannabis product to be tracked back to the licensee and specific cultivation site, to the block and bed level or similar identification, and tracked forward up the supply chain to the next distribution point.
So again, nothing to mention there, sorry to interrupt you, Jason, about individual plants. The tracking is about the most distinguished is to the block or bed level. That's just interesting to note.
And be able to link harvested cannabis by batch.
Zach, sorry, just to go back to that, what's really the difference there?
So they're not asking for you to be able to track that eighth of flower on the shelf back to an individual plant in the field. They're having you track it back to the bed. So in our case, it's a 100-foot long bed that's 3 foot wide, and we can plant 20 to 25 plants per bed depending on when we plant in the season. A block may be like in a hydroponic setting where you have like a 10 by 10 block that has 25 plants in it, so like they want to know the grouping, not the individual. So again, why the emphasis on the tagging of every individual plant, especially when you have like a ton of small little plants. There's example as to why other states do it, etc., but like they're not asking for that data. So it just, why do we need to do that then? And also, like, I hope they don't make us do that, because it's a much more precarious lift when every single plant, if you're tracking that 8th jar back to the plant. Just food for thought.
All right. Be able to link harvested cannabis by batch number or harvest date to the cultivation records. Such data shall be made available to the office upon request and may be required in the cultivator's annual cultivation report. Have an on-site premises-based identification system which shall be able to integrate with the seed to sale inventory management system used by the office, and have an indoor or mixed light cannabis cultivation facility that shall satisfy energy efficiency and equipment standards established by the office and meet all applicable environmental laws, regulations, permits, and other applicable approvals, including but not limited to those related to water quality and quantity, wastewater, solid and hazardous waste management, and air pollution. How much is left in this section? Because
let's bump
14
through here. My thing's gonna be a little bit laggy here.
Quite a bit.
Pardon?
Quite a bit, it looks like.
Yeah, so I think this is a safe place to pause. So we are on page 130, and yeah, we got a question in the chat. Is this to assume that the OCM does not want natural farming inputs created and used? Hard to create a label for locally sourced inputs created on the farm. Does not seem to track with their approach to sustainability. This is a question we've been talking about, how like they want every single input, tested, like really a lot of data on particular applications and inputs. And there are like advanced regenerative practices, or even just moderate regenerative practices, such as making your own compost and spreading it on your beds, or making a compost tea. Like one could say, like, are we prohibited from using that if we don't have full tests on that product And it's one thing if you're spraying that product on plants versus if you're plugging it into your drip feed system or putting it into your soil. So definitely a question that I've heard asked, and I know people are creating comments to say, like, please exclude on-farm made products, for example, from like having to have been, again, when you're spraying something on the plant that could get transferred into a consumable or combustible, that's definitely something to be aware of. And it's like, okay, it's also a question of like spraying something on a plant when it's immature versus when it's flowering. These are all kind of little like things to consider when we're looking at risk specifically. But again, everything you're saying, Justin, is like OCM seems to be supporting on-farm management, sustainable, like nutrient management solutions, but it feels like the way they're framing this out may be a little bit prohibitive of doing such practices. And it would be a great question and a request for clarification. All right, great. Well, we are at the magic hour. Another really, really wild ride through the New York State proposed adult use regulations. Jason, Elise, I thank you so much for your time and perspective. Thanks to everyone who's on the call watching live and asking questions, and everyone who's watching this recorded. Hopefully this is helpful. Big thanks to CANY and the Rochester Public Library, and we will see you all next week. This is a Tuesday, Thursday initiative, noon to 1:15. So stay tuned, make sure you register in advance, and we will see you all soon. Thank you, Ira. Everyone take care. Have a great week and weekend.